Hey there. Tonight we're stepping into the world of ancient Rome, a place of packed arenas, rigid training schools, and a class of fighters whose lives were centered on the sand. This is the story of the gladiators, people who trained, fought, and lived under strict rules for sport, status, and sometimes survival. They learned weapons, tactics, and discipline. Some were slaves, others volunteered for pay or reputation. Over time, they became part of public life, tied to politics, spectacle, and the rhythms of the city. In this narration, we will move through their days, their struggles, and the routines that shaped them. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Dim the lights, let the calm settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin with the life of a gladiator. The story of the origins of gladiators begins with a mixture of ritual practice and social change. In early Italy, some communities performed contests connected to funerals. These contests are the earliest roots of what later became gladiatorial combat. Archaeological evidence and later writers point to practices among the Etruscans and other Italic peoples, where combat and public display marked certain rites. Over time, those local customs changed shape as Rome grew and absorbed new peoples and traditions. In this way, a ritual practice moved from private or local settings into the larger public life of the city. Recruitment for the first gladiatorial shows followed the social realities of the time. The people who fought most often came from three main groups. The first group was slaves. Slaves belonged to private owners or to the managers of training schools. They could be bought, sold, trained, and displayed. The owner or manager decided how they would be used in shows. Slaves were a ready supply because Rome had access to labor from many conquered territories. The second group consisted of prisoners of war and condemned criminals. When armies captured enemies on the battlefield, some of those captives were brought to Rome and used for public spectacles. Similarly, people convicted of certain crimes were sometimes sentenced to fight. Their legal status changed at that point, and they were often treated as expendable for the purposes of spectacle. The third group included volunteers. These were free men who chose to enter the arena for pay, debt relief, or a chance at fame. They signed contracts and accepted conditions that removed many of their civil protections while they served. Over time, each of these paths into the arena developed its own patterns and expectations. The legal status of a gladiator reflected the path by which he had entered the arena. Those who were slaves remained the property of their masters. They were expected to obey, to train, and to perform. The owner profited from their labor and could determine their fate. Prisoners of war or those condemned by the courts occupied a similar place of subordination. They were treated as part of the supply of fighters and had limited rights. Volunteers, known in later sources by a Latin term that describes their contract, gave up certain rights when they enrolled. In signing a contract, a free man agreed to become what the law called an infames, a person with a lowered legal and social standing. This status, sometimes referred to as infamia, meant that the person could lose the right to hold certain positions, to serve as a legal witness in particular cases, or to enjoy full civic privileges while under contract. The arrangement was legal and formal. A free man who chose to serve acknowledged the limitations. In this way, the Roman system allowed different legal realities to coexist within the same spectacle. Managers and owners played an important role in shaping the lives of gladiators. These managers, often called by a Latin label that identifies their role as trainers and owners, operated training schools known as ludi. A ludus was a place for instruction, discipline, and control. The manager bought recruits, hired trainers, arranged food and shelter, and sold fighters to organizers of public games. Many of the early gladiators lived under the authority of a manager who held practical control over their daily routines. The manager arranged bouts, negotiated payments, and oversaw medical care when it was offered. In this way, the legal arrangements tied directly to everyday life. The first recorded gladiatorial combat in Rome is dated in surviving accounts to 264 BCE. Writers who lived centuries later recorded that this event was tied to a funeral. In that instance, 3 pairs of fighters faced one another in a formal match offered in honor of the dead. The purpose was originally religious. In these early contexts, the combat belonged to a wider set of rites that marked death and memory. It functioned as a way to honor a deceased person, to fulfill a family obligation, and to perform a public demonstration that expressed both piety and power. Over time, the form and meaning of these events changed. The religious meaning of early games deserves careful attention. In their original setting, the contests were part of offerings to the spirits of the dead. They were not intended first and foremost as entertainment. Instead, families and communities performed them as a public part of funeral practice. This connection to religion meant that the combat was regulated by custom and expectation. It was expected to be solemn and structured. The fighters participated as part of a larger ceremony. As Rome expanded, the games moved beyond the funeral context. Rulers and magistrates began to hold them on public stages and at public expense. Meanwhile, the religious framework gradually loosened. Ritual elements remained, but the emphasis shifted toward display, politics, and mass entertainment. In this way, something that began as a religious act became a civic spectacle. Early social perceptions of gladiators were shaped by these origins. At first, their role was closely linked to death and ritual. That association affected how members of Roman society understood the fighters. Among the upper classes, the idea of men fighting in public for reward or punishment carried a degree of shame. Leading moralists and many conservative citizens regarded the contests with suspicion. They saw the spectacle as inconsistent with the ideals of Roman dignity and private virtue. In speeches and writings, some elites criticized the display of blood and the prominence given to low-status men and foreigners. For them, the games represented a kind of decline in public morals. This attitude did not end the games. Rather, it remained part of an ongoing debate about the place of spectacle in civic life. At the same time, other parts of society received the gladiatorial spectacle differently. The lower and middle classes often saw the games as public entertainment and as an occasion for social gathering. Markets, political gestures, and shows all happened together. For many ordinary Romans, the fights offered a chance to watch skill, risk, and confrontation in a public setting. Skilled fighters earned admiration for their technique. Over time, successful gladiators could gain considerable public attention. They might win rewards, receive gifts from admirers, and be remembered in inscriptions. This popular interest coexisted with elite disapproval. The same person could be both admired by the crowd and disdained by the senators. Political leaders took advantage of these divided perceptions. Magistrates and generals used the games to curry public favor. Offering games became a way to display wealth, to secure votes, and to show generosity to the people. In doing so, officials converted an originally private ritual into a public tool. The transformation had social consequences. As more spectacles were put on by those seeking political advantage, the scale and regularity of the games increased. They moved from occasional funerary observances into organized public programs. In this way, recruitment and legal control remained central, but the social meaning of the fights expanded. Over the same period, the practical organization of gladiatorial training and supply became more professional. Managers, trainers, and medical attendants developed routines. Training schools taught techniques and kept records. Owners and sponsors negotiated the terms of contests. The growing structure made it possible to stage larger events and to maintain a supply of trained fighters. Meanwhile, the legal definitions of status, slave, condemned, or volunteer, continued to determine how individuals entered and experienced the arena. A slave could be trained to excel, but ownership meant that profits flowed to another. A condemned criminal had little hope of a full legal life. A volunteer might gain tangible rewards, but he did so by accepting an altered legal position. As the city continued to change, so did how people talked about gladiators. Early writers preserved accounts that emphasized both the roots in ritual and the emerging spectacle. They recorded the first public bouts and linked them to custom. They also noted the increasing scale of the events. Over time, historians and commentators described a culture in which gladiatorial games were regular elements of civic life. For listeners at the time, the history of the games could be a way to explain shifts in public taste and political practice. In this way, the origins of gladiators remained a topic that connected religion, law, and social feeling. To summarize the key points, recruitment began with slaves and prisoners of war, and later included volunteers who entered by contract. Legal status followed those different paths, producing distinct conditions for life and work. The first recorded games in Rome are dated to 264 BCE and were connected to funerary ritual and religious obligation. Over time, the religious meaning lessened as the events moved into public life and politics. Early social perception was mixed. Many elite observers disapproved, viewing the games as a mark of moral decline. At the same time, ordinary citizens often attended and admired skilled fighters. Politicians used the games to secure favor, which increased their frequency and prominence. In this calm view, the origins of gladiators are not a single moment, but a long process. Small, local customs blended with practical needs and political choices. The people who fought came from different social backgrounds, and their legal situations reflected those differences. The rituals that first produced combat slowly gave way to entertainment and civic display. Yet the memory of ritual meaning and the structure of law continued to shape the lives of those who entered the arena. Over time, the institution grew complex. but its beginnings can be traced to a few connected practices: funerary observance, the availability of captives, and a public appetite for organized contests. In this way, the origin story is a steady account of how ritual, law, and social change combined to create a distinctive and lasting part of Roman public life. A ludus was first of all a place for training. It was also a workplace, a dormitory, and a small community. Men who came there did not lead private lives in the usual sense. Their time, their movements, and their labor were organized by others. In this way, the school shaped each day with steady rules and a clear purpose. The routine was strict, and the behavior expected of trainees reflected that strictness. Mornings began early. The trainees rose before sunrise and moved quickly into the courtyard or training hall. The schedule that followed was consistent from one day to the next. Warm-up exercises came first. Fighters walked through basic movements, stretched, and rehearsed footwork. Some did light sparring to test reflexes. Trainers watched closely and corrected posture, timing, and grip. Repetition mattered. In each motion, there was an emphasis on precise technique. Over time, that repetition taught the body to react automatically. After warm-up, instruction grew more specialized. Doctors, these were the experienced teachers and technical trainers, divided trainees by weapon type. One group practiced with short swords. Another worked with shields and spears. A third trained in lighter, faster fighting styles. The doctors demonstrated, and then they supervised practice bouts. Equipment was used in training that resembled, but did not always match, the gear used in the arena. Wooden weapons and blunted edges allowed for controlled instruction. Meanwhile, trainers corrected mistakes and adjusted exercise plans to individual needs. 40 minutes to an hour often followed of endurance work. Marching, running, and other forms of stamina training were common. Carrying weights and practicing with combinations of armor and weapons tested fatigue. In this way, trainees learned to fight while tired, which was crucial for real contests. Strength training, though less formal than modern weightlifting, focused on repetitive tasks that increased muscle endurance. Over time, a trainee's daily pattern built both skill and reserve. Food and rest were part of the regimen. Meals were scheduled at fixed times. Bread, porridge, pulses, and occasional meat provided calories and bulk. The staple menu varied by time and place, but the basic aim was the same: provide energy and maintain body weight. Owners of the school, often cautious about their investment, balanced cost with nutrition. Some ludi offered more generous rations to favored fighters or those who performed well in training. Others kept stricter control. In either case, food distribution was a routine moment in the day. Trainees ate together under supervision, and conversations were brief and practical, often about techniques, injuries, or upcoming matches. Medical care existed alongside dietary provision. Trainers and owners understood that a healthy fighter was valuable. Many ludi employed attendants with basic medical knowledge. These attendants treated cuts, set bones, and administered herbal remedies. More serious cases involved skilled medical practitioners, often known for their work with soldiers or athletes. When a fighter received a deep wound, rest and care followed a known pattern. Cleaning the wound, applying dressings, and limiting movement came first. Then, depending on the injury, gentle exercises might resume to prevent stiffness. In some schools, a surgeon's work could be decisive. A well-treated fighter often returned to training more quickly than one left to recover without attention. Living conditions were functional. Sleeping quarters were shared and designed for efficiency. Bunks or simple platforms lined the rooms, and the space kept only what was necessary. Personal possessions were few. Clothes and armor were usually issued by the school. Privacy was limited, and daily routines unfolded in public. Sanitation varied by location and by the quality of the owner. Some ludi had basic facilities for washing and limited laundering services. Others had less and relied on the personal initiative of trainees to maintain cleanliness. Overall, the environment encouraged communal life, in which individual comfort was secondary to group discipline. A clear hierarchy kept order. At the top stood the Lanista, the manager and owner of the fighters in his care. The Lanista contracted for shows, bought recruits, and negotiated with sponsors. He controlled finances and set rules. Discipline ultimately tied back to his authority. Doctors formed the next level in the chain. These were men trained specifically to teach fighting. Many had years of experience in the arena or in military service. They knew how to drill, how to correct mistakes, and how to prepare a fighter for the stress of combat. Between the doctors and the ordinary trainees stood the veteran fighters. These veterans held status not because of legal rank, but because of experience. They acted as informal leaders, models of technique, and sometimes as enforcers of the rules. New trainees learned by watching veterans and by obeying instructions given by them. Within that hierarchy, responsibility was distributed. Doctors prepared daily plans and led instruction. Veterans mentored younger fighters in practical habits, such as how to clean armor or tend to small wounds. Lanista set broader policies. He decided on the pairing of fighters for public shows and determined who received special privileges. In this way, the school functioned as a small organization with tasks assigned according to rank and skill. Obedience was more than a preference. It was a condition of life in a ludus. Rules governed waking times, training schedules, meals, and rest periods. Trainees learned to follow orders without delay. That habit served a practical purpose. In combat, hesitation could be fatal. In the school, immediate response to instruction saved time and reduced conflict. Over time, obedience became part of a practical culture. Trainees relied on the structure to shape their days and to reduce uncertainty. Punishments enforced that culture of obedience. They ranged from mild to severe. Public reprimand was common. A trainer might call out a mistake in front of others as a warning. For more serious infractions, reductions in rations or extra training sessions served as penalties. Physical punishments were also used. Flogging or beatings could be administered for disobedience, though the intensity varied with the Lanista and with local custom. Chains or confinement were possibilities for those judged to have broken rules more drastically. The aim of punishment was both practical and symbolic. On one level, it corrected behavior. On another, it reminded others where authority rested and what would follow disobedience. Rewards balanced punishments. Success in training brought privileges. A fighter who distinguished himself might receive extra food, better sleeping arrangements, or special clothing. Sponsors or spectators from the city sometimes gave gifts to favored fighters. Monetary bonuses for victory were common in public shows, and those bonuses could translate into improved conditions back in the ludus. The wooden sword, known by a Latin name as a rudis, sometimes marked a formal reward. Receiving a rudis signified that a fighter had earned his freedom, or at least a marked status. Not every reward was material. Approval from a respected veterane or praise from a doctor carried social value. In this way, the system combined material incentives with social recognition to shape conduct. The daily routine reinforced expectations of order and low personal fuss. Each task had a place in the schedule. Equipment inspections happened at set times. Armor was cleaned, weapons were sharpened, and small repairs took place under the watchful eye of a veteran or a trainer. Inspections themselves reinforced discipline. A well-maintained shield or helmet showed attention to duty. Conversely, neglect could attract formal correction. In this way, care for equipment became a measure of a man's reliability. Training sessions also cultivated a sense of team responsibility. Although fights had an individual element, many exercises involved paired work and group drills. Trainees learned to anticipate another's movement and to trust instructions. Teamwork mattered in practice. When a bout approached, opponents sometimes sparred in ways designed to test specific weaknesses. Meanwhile, injuries and recovery required coordinated care. A trained group could manage one another's wounds and help maintain daily life. This cooperative aspect softened the harsher details of disciplined life. It produced routines of mutual support, even if the larger system remained hierarchical. Over time, the experience of living in a ludus shaped a fighter's identity. Discipline and repetition formed habits. Respect for authority became practical. On the other hand, the close relationships built through daily work created bonds. Men who shared the same schedule and the same trials came to rely on one another. Veterans passed on knowledge. Doctors molded technique. Lanista defined the limits of autonomy. Each role had its function in sustaining the school. Financial considerations mixed with care. Owners had material incentives to maintain their fighters' health. A wounded or dead fighter represented a loss. Thus, medical investment and measured discipline were practical choices as much as moral ones. Treating a wound properly shortened recovery time. Feeding a valued fighter more generously improved performance. Indeed, some Lannister ran their schools as businesses that depended on the continued success of their men. The tension between profit and care shaped many decisions inside the ludus. Discipline extended into moral instruction as well. Trainers emphasized restraint, steadiness, and measured response. Aggressive or reckless behavior in training was discouraged if it endangered others or spoiled technique. Trainees were taught not only how to strike, but when to hold back. In this way, obedience also meant judgment, knowing when to follow orders and when to exercise controlled initiative. That balance proved essential in an arena where an impulsive action might end a career. Routines varied from school to school. A well-funded ludus offered more specialists and better food. A smaller or poorer school made do with fewer comforts. Yet across differences, common patterns persisted. The day began early and ended late. Work was consistent. Respect for hierarchy remained central. Punishments and rewards kept conduct within expected limits. Medical care and basic comforts existed, but they were practical rather than luxurious. Life in a ludus was not easy. It was tightly regulated and often harsh. At the same time, it offered training, a sense of purpose, and for some, a path to recognition or an altered legal status. When a fighter left the training ground for the arena, he carried the lessons of the ludus with him. The steady routines, the repeated drills, and the ingrained obedience all showed up in how he moved and how he responded under stress. In this way, the training school shaped not only bodies, but habits of mind and patterns of social relation. It trained men to act in predictable ways under pressure. That predictability served owners, sponsors, and the public. In quiet moments, away from drills and inspections, trainees reflected on the meanings of their work. Some thought of freedom and the possibility of leaving with a Rudy's. Others sought steady pay or a chance at public fame. Many measured their lives by daily routine and by the small rewards that came with success. Over time, the small comforts and the camaraderie of the school became as significant as the contests themselves. In closing, the training schools were institutions of discipline and instruction. Daily life inside them was organized around strict schedules and clear hierarchies. Food, medical care, and living conditions reflected a balance between cost and care. Lanista, doctors, and veteran fighters each filled defined roles that sustained the school. Punishments maintained order, while rewards encouraged progress. In this way, Ludi functioned as controlled environments that prepared men for the arena and shaped their lives in steady, persistent ways. Gladiators in ancient Rome were not all the same. Over time, several distinct types developed, each with its own set of weapons, armor, and fighting style. These types became familiar to the public and to the men who trained and fought. In this narration, I will describe 5 of the main categories that appear most often in Roman records and art. They are the murmillo, the retiarius, the secutor, the thrieks, and the hoplomachus. For each one, I will outline the equipment they used, the way they usually fought, the symbolic role they played in the arena, and the economic side of their gear and sponsorship. The murmillo is often thought of as a heavy, well-armored fighter. He wore a large helmet that covered much of the head and face. The helmet commonly had a broad brim and a crest. Across the face, there was a visor with openings for the eyes. This helmet limited peripheral vision, but it offered solid protection against incoming blows. The murmillo carried a large shield that covered most of the body. The shield was held with a strong grip and used both defensively and offensively. In his right hand, he commonly used a short sword, similar in form to the Roman gladius. Protective gear also included an arm guard, known in Latin as a manica, and greaves on one or both legs. In combat, the murmillo relied on weight and stability. He moved steadily, using the shield to block and the sword for close attack. Matches with lighter opponents often emphasized the murmillo's ability to absorb pressure and to finish an exchange at close range. By contrast, the retiarius fought with far less armor and with a very different toolkit. His primary weapons were a net and a 3-pronged spear or trident. In Latin, the net was called a rete, and the spear-like weapon could be described as a tridens. He also carried a short dagger for close work. Armor for a retiarius was minimal. A metal shoulder guard sometimes protected the left side, and a light arm guard might cover one arm. Otherwise, the Retiarius fought mainly in a loincloth and sandals. This light equipment made him quick and mobile. He tried to use the net to entangle an opponent, and then to strike with the trident while keeping distance. When the net failed or when contact became close, he used the dagger. The Retiarius was unusual among gladiators because he did not commonly wear a helmet. This added to his vulnerability, but also to his distinct style. Spectators often found the Retiarius exciting because his matches showcased speed, timing, and improvisation. The Secutor developed as a counterpart to the Retiarius. His name indicates a pursuer. He carried a large shield and a short sword similar to that of the Murmillo. His helmet differed from the Murmillo S in a specific way. It had a smooth, rounded surface and small eye openings. Those features reduced the chance that the net would catch on the helmet or that an opponent could reach into openings. The Secutor wore heavy protection otherwise, including a manica and greaves. In combat, the Secutor advanced methodically. He closed distance and tried to limit the Retiarius's room to use the net or the trident. Over time, the Secutor and the Retiarius became a familiar pairing in the arena, an almost choreographed contrast between a net-wielding, lightly armed fighter and a heavily armored pursuer. The Threeks, often described as the Thracian type, carried a small shield and a curved short sword called a sica. The shield was smaller than those of the Murmillo and Secutor, but it allowed for greater mobility. The Threeks wore a helmet with a broad brim, and often with a decorative crest over the brow. Greaves protected the legs, and an arm guard covered at least one arm. Fighting style for a Threeks emphasized quick, angled attacks. The curve of the sica made it easier to reach around an opponent's shield, or to strike at exposed flesh. For these reasons, the Threeks had to work more with positioning and timing than with brute force. He often faced larger opponents with more armor, and his tactics reflected a need to find or create small openings in which to strike. The Hoplomachus took inspiration from Greek hoplite arms and tactics. He carried a spear for the initial engagement and a short sword for close work. A small round shield or round buckler accompanied his spear. Protective gear included a helmet with a crest, a manica, and greaves. In the arena, the Hoplomachus used the spear to attack from a slightly longer distance, and then switched to the sword when the fighters came together. He blended thrusting and slashing techniques. Although the Hoplomachus had antecedents in foreign military styles, his role in the arena was defined by the need to demonstrate a particular set of skills, rather than to simulate actual battlefield formations. Each of these types had a symbolic role in public spectacles. The armored types like the Murmillo and the Secutor represented solidity and strength. In this way, they could stand for martial values that Roman audiences respected. The lighter types, such as the Retiarius, suggested cunning and speed. The Threeks and the Hoplomachus carried echoes of foreign warriors, which made their matches a form of controlled encounter with the unfamiliar. Pairings were not accidental. Promoters of the games and the owners of gladiators arranged matches that contrasted styles. A Retiarius facing a Secutor created a clear tension between entangling and pursuing. A Threeks against a Murmillo highlighted speed against mass. These contrasts made the contests easier to follow for large crowds. They also allowed gladiators to become known for their particular skills. Some fighters gained reputations as expert retiarii or as firm-muscled murmelones. Over time, public favorites emerged when a gladiator's skill or temperament resonated with spectators. Popularity could have practical effects. A well-liked gladiator might receive gifts from fans, or he might be remembered in inscriptions and graffiti. Sponsors and magistrates who organized the games sometimes used popular gladiators to heighten the appeal of a spectacle. Conversely, less distinguished fighters typically remained known only within the small circle of their training school. Fame in the arena could bring material benefits, but it also increased risk. A celebrated fighter could be expected to appear in more shows, to take part in more dangerous bouts, and to endure more public attention. Yet for some men, that visibility led to steady rewards and to a kind of social recognition that extended beyond the amphitheater. Cost and sponsorship were important behind the scenes. Equipment could be expensive. Heavy helmets with visors, finely worked shields, and metal greaves required skilled craftsmen and good materials. Owners of gladiators, often Lannisty who ran training schools, invested in this equipment because they needed fighters who could perform and who could survive. A heavy-armed fighter therefore represented a significant investment. Meanwhile, Aurelius's net and trident were simpler to produce, but they still required quality materials if they were to function reliably in combat. Nets that tore or tridents that bent could make a difference in a match. Apprentices and managers replaced worn gear as needed, and those costs were part of running a ludus. Elite sponsorship added another layer. Wealthy individuals and public officials who organized games, sometimes called editors or sponsors, often supplied new helmets, ornate shields, or specially commissioned items to decorate the spectacle. They might present a gladiator with a finely made helmet as a public gesture, or they might pay for superior medical care after a severe wound. In this way, the displays of generosity also reinforced social bonds. Elites sought public approval by supporting fighters and the games, and gladiators became visible instruments in that relationship. Over time, a prominent sponsor could elevate certain gladiators by providing the best available equipment. That patronage sometimes helped a talented fighter to survive longer in the arena and to pursue a reputation that would attract additional gifts. Costs also shaped daily life in the schools. Lannisty balanced the expense of equipment against the expected earnings from fights. A well-maintained shield could be used in many bouts, and investing in repairs often made financial sense. Some schools specialized in producing certain types of fighters and therefore invested in the appropriate gear. Others kept stricter accounts and provided only basic equipment. In either case, the economics influenced what a fighter could expect. A gladiator who earned prizes or donations could acquire personal items, but most gear remained the property of the school or of patrons. Training adapted to the demands of each type. Murmelones practiced moving with heavy shields and short swords. Retiarii rehearsed net throws, footwork, and rapid recovery with the dagger. Secutors trained to cut off angles and to resist entanglement. Threses worked on slips of movement that would allow their Sika to find openings. Hoplamachi focused on switching between spear work and short sword combat. In every case, practice sought to mirror the conditions of the arena. Trainers and veteran fighters taught tactics that conserved energy and reduced risk. Meanwhile, equipment training emphasized how to use armor to advantage and how to maintain it between bouts. The public recognized many of these differences. Sculptures, mosaics, and written accounts show specific pairings and favored matchups. Over time, the distinctive shapes of helmets, the curve of a sika, and the sight of a net in motion came to mean something to spectators. Those visual cues helped an audience to follow the match, and they contributed to the shared language of spectacle. The games were performances shaped by rules and by the practicalities of armament. At the same time, the human element remained central. Skill, timing, and endurance often mattered more than the equipment alone. In closing, the main types of gladiators, Murmillo, Retiarius, Secutor, Threeks, and Hoplomachus, represent a balance between body, weapon, and strategy. Their armor and weapons suited particular fighting styles, and promoters arranged pairings that highlighted contrasts. Symbolic meanings and public tastes shaped which fighters became favorites. The costs of equipment and the role of sponsors influenced both the spectacle and the daily care of gladiators. Over time, these patterns made the arena a place in which practiced skill and carefully chosen gear combined to create contests that were easy for a public to understand and to follow. The distinctions among these types help us see how Roman spectacle relied on both human training and material resources. In this way, the equipment, the style of fighting, and the social context fit together into a coherent system that guided life in the arena and life around it. Training for the arena began early, and it was strict. In a ludus, the training school, novices lived under a close, organized routine that shaped the body and the habits of a gladiator. Exercises emphasized strength, endurance, and skill with particular weapons. Some men practiced with wooden swords that weighed more than a fighting sword, so that the real weapon felt lighter in the heat of a contest. Others ran, lifted, and sparred in controlled drills. Trainers, called doctors or magistri, supervised movements, corrected posture, and set the pace. They did not aim only at violence. Technique mattered. Footwork, timing, and the control of distance were carefully taught. In this way, a fighter learned how to manage energy and how to use armor and shield in a coordinated way. Daily training was repetitive by design. Repetition built muscle memory and reduced the risk of error under pressure. Warm-up exercises preceded more strenuous work. For many, training included sessions with a shield on one arm and a sword in the other, or with a net and trident if they were to be retiarii. Trainers staged mock fights that resembled planned choreographies. These rehearsals allowed fighters to practice defensive responses and to learn to read an opponent's intentions. Over time, practice could produce an impressive degree of control. Still, the exercises themselves caused wear. Muscles strained, joints ached, and small injuries accumulated. Injuries were constant companions. Blisters and cuts were common after long hours of practice. More serious wounds occurred during sparring. Helmets and padding reduced the risk of fatal blows, but bones and ligaments suffered from repeated impact. Fractures, dislocations, and deep contusions were part of the daily reality. When matches happened in the arena, injuries could be severe. Weapons were designed to wound and to test an opponent's limits. Even when matches were staged with rules, a mistimed step or a shield that slipped could lead to a heavy cut or a broken limb. In this way, the life of a gladiator included a persistent cycle of damage and repair. Medical care existed alongside these harms. Doctors and attendants tended to cuts and set bones. In some training schools, physicians treated fighters with dressings, poultices, and surgical attention. Roman surgeons had techniques for removing arrows and cleaning wounds. Over time, specific methods developed to treat the types of injuries gladiators suffered most often. For example, a well-placed splint or a properly set fracture could mean the difference between a return to the arena and long-term disability. Yet treatment was not always thorough by modern standards. Infections could take hold after a wound. Without reliable antibiotics, a bad infection could become life-threatening. This medical reality contributed to the overall toll. Life expectancy for gladiators was shorter than for many free citizens. Several factors combined to produce high mortality. First, the nature of the contests put men at risk of fatal injury. Matches sometimes ended with death or severe maiming. Second, repeated injuries weakened bodies over time. Even when fighters survived a particular match, cumulative damage diminished their resilience. Third, the social and legal status of many gladiators added vulnerability. Slaves who served as gladiators could not refuse dangerous assignments and were subject to the decisions of owners and managers. Free men who chose the profession did so with the knowledge that risk was part of the contract, and some accepted shorter lives in return for possible fame and rewards. Statistical clarity is difficult for this period. Sources do not provide systematic life tables. Still, many contemporaries recognize the brutal arithmetic of the profession. A new recruit might expect only a few active years in the arena before age, injury, or accumulated wounds forced retirement. Some survived longer, and a few won the privilege of freedom, symbolized by the wooden sword called a rudis. In this way, the possibility of manumission sometimes motivated endurance. Yet freedom did not guarantee a long life. Once released, former gladiators frequently faced economic and social challenges, and some returned to combat for money. A range of conditions raised the mortality rate beyond the immediate hazard of a fight. Infections from wounds, complications from broken bones, and the effects of untreated internal injuries were common. Heat, dehydration, and exhaustion could precipitate collapse in the arena, particularly on hot days when events lasted for hours. Nutritional deficits hampered recovery. Although some gladiators ate well under the supervision of trainers who wanted strong fighters, others suffered from uneven diets that left them less prepared to heal. Over time, these combined conditions produced a pattern of shortened careers and higher than average deaths. Repeated combat affected minds as well as bodies. The psychological impact was profound and complex. Many gladiators entered the arena with fear and with a heightened awareness of danger. That fear did not disappear with practice. Rather, it became a working part of how a fighter performed. A steady routine helped to organize days and to reduce anxiety. Training, drills, and measured progress gave a structure that allowed men to focus on tasks rather than on the uncertain future. In this way, discipline could be a protective mechanism. At the same time, repeated exposure to violence could desensitize. Some fighters reported a narrowing of emotion and a focus on the immediate demands of the match. They learned to suppress panic and to channel attention into specific actions. For many, comradeship within the ludus provided an emotional anchor. Men who trained together ate together and shared risks. Those bonds created loyalties and small communities within a larger social system that often treated them as expendable. Friendships softened the harshness of daily life and provided mutual care when wounds needed dressing or when morale faltered. Psychological strain also came from public expectations. Spectators watched with keen interest. A crowd's response could uplift a gladiator who moved skillfully, and it could demoralize one who faltered. Some fighters felt pressure to perform for sponsors, to live up to an image, or to secure favor that might improve their material conditions. Meanwhile, the memory of friends lost in the arena weighed heavily. Grief and survivor guilt were common responses when a companion failed to recover from a match. Over time, these emotional burdens shaped behavior. Some men grew stoic and focused only on technique. Others sought more risk, perhaps to gain a quick reputation or to earn money for their families. The psychological landscape of a gladiator's life was varied and often conflicted. Punishments and discipline in the ludus added another layer of stress. Owners and managers disciplined those who broke rules or failed to meet expectations. Whippings, fines of food, and cutbacks in privileges were possible. On occasion, more severe penalties followed. For enslaved gladiators, the threat of corporal punishment and even death for disobedience was ever present. In free men, social shame and the loss of standing within the school served as sanctions. Discipline reinforced order, but it also intensified the experience of risk and the daily pressure to conform. Amid these hardships, stories of exceptional men circulated and became part of public memory. Some gladiators rose to fame despite the difficult conditions. One well-known account comes from a fight recorded by the Roman poet Martial. He described a match between two fighters, Priscus and Verus, during the inaugural games of the Flavian amphitheater in the 1st century CE. The bout was notable because it ended without a clear victor in the usual sense. The emperor at the time, Titus, declared both men winners and awarded them each a symbolic palm and freedom. Martial's poem highlights the rare moment when victory and clemency met in public. The story has lasted because it shows a different possible outcome for those who fought. Another figure known from inscriptions is a man called Flamma. He fought many times and was offered the wooden sword indicating freedom on multiple occasions. He reportedly refused the offer more than once and continued to fight. His case illustrates complex motives. For some, the life of the arena, with its routines, comrades, and rewards, could be preferable to the uncertain freedom outside. In Flamma's case, the record suggests personal choices shaped by circumstances and by the attachments formed within the ludus. Spartacus is among the most famous names linked to the gladiatorial world. A Thracian by origin, he trained and fought as a gladiator before leading a large slave rebellion in the 1st century BCE. His story reached later generations as an account of resistance and escape from the system of forced combat. The rebellion itself displayed how desperate men could seek a different life when the conditions of slavery and forced fighting became unbearable. Spartacus's life ended in battle, but his story has remained a point of reference for understanding the pressures that drove some gladiators to take extreme risks. other fighters became celebrated for particular skills. Carpophorus, for example, is remembered as a bestiarius who excelled in fights with wild animals. His reputation came from repeated success in a dangerous specialty. Such men could earn a distinct status that combined admiration and fear. Sponsors and spectators sometimes lavished gifts on top performers. Over time, a few gladiators acquired wealth and influence unusual for men of their origin. Yet these cases remained exceptions against a background of great hardship. Legends surrounding famous gladiators often changed in the retelling. Ancient poets and later commentators emphasized different elements: bravery, suffering, loyalty, or defiance, according to their purposes. Meanwhile, material evidence such as inscriptions, mosaics, and graffiti added everyday details. Together, these sources provide a layered picture. They show a profession where discipline and danger coexisted with moments of honor and public recognition. In this way, the lives of certain men became stories that others passed on to remember what the arena demanded. In considering this world, it is important to acknowledge both the routine and the exceptional. Longevity was rare, and many careers were short. Danger and injury were constant. Yet training instilled skills and habits that allowed some to endure longer than might otherwise have been possible. Psychological mechanisms, whether camaraderie, focus, or acceptance of risk, helped men to navigate an uncertain life. Meanwhile, a handful of individuals achieved renown that outlasted their own lifetimes. Their stories remind us that human lives in the arena were varied, shaped by forces of social structure, economics, and personal choice. The discipline of the ludus, the work of doctors and trainers, the pressure of public expectation, and the everyday presence of injury combined to define a harsh world. Still, within that world men found ways to live, to form bonds, and to pursue survival or status. In the end, the record that reaches us shows a profession marked by danger and loss, but also by resilience and occasional reward. This balanced view helps to explain how the arena functioned as an institution and how individuals navigated its demands over time. The games of the arena began with a clear sense of order and purpose. Officials prepared long before the first trumpet sounded. A procession moved from the city gates toward the amphitheater. This parade, often called a pampa, brought participants, musicians, and attendants into public view. Priests and magistrates took part. Musicians played, banners moved, and those who had arranged the games led the way. In this way, the event announced itself as a public duty and a communal ritual. Spectators gathered along the route and then filed into seats according to rank. Social distinctions were visible and deliberate. Senators, equestrians, local officials, and common citizens occupied different sections. Women, children, and slaves had places assigned to them. The seating plan reflected civic order as much as it served convenience. Ceremonies at the opening of a program followed customary forms. Prayers and sacrifices addressed gods associated with protection and victory. A libation might be poured, and animals chosen for later display were sometimes offered. Meanwhile, a brief ritual could honor those whose memory was the reason for public munera, or gifts. In the case of games held to mark a public office or a funeral, the ceremony linked present politics and private commemoration. The editor, the official who financed the shows, would make a statement of purpose. He declared the games open and acknowledged the contracts with providers of fighters and animals. Trumpets and drums marked the transitions between segments. In this way, the flow of events followed a plan that combined religious observance, civic display, and entertainment. A formal schedule organized the day. Morning sessions often began with venations, the hunts or staged encounters with animals. Later segments featured display fights, gladiatorial contests, and more elaborate shows. Executions typically took place before the main combat, so that the crowd could witness the judgment of law. Finally, the most awaited matches closed the day. Between events, clerks and attendants managed the gates, recorded outcomes, and prepared the space for the next act. Over time, this procedural rhythm became familiar to regular attendees. The repetition gave the program a predictable shape that helped the large crowds to follow proceedings without confusion. Political motives were a central reason such spectacles existed. Public officials and emperors used the games to show generosity and to consolidate support. Funding a set of games required resources and organization, and the gift of public spectacle created a visible bond between ruler and people. Officials practiced a form of civic patronage. Meanwhile, the crowd's approval served as a measure of political success. Those who provided particularly lavish shows could expect praise and expanded influence. In municipal contexts, local elites also sponsored games to advance careers and to secure votes. Over time, the expectation that magistrates should stage games became part of civic life. The content of the spectacles also carried messages. Displays of exotic animals suggested the reach and power of the state. Processions of captives or reenactments of military victories reminded spectators of conquest and the maintenance of order. In this way, the arena functioned as a public theater of authority. Officials could demonstrate magnanimity through clemency or severity through punishment. A well-timed act of mercy, such as releasing a favored fighter, could win popular gratitude. Conversely, public executions underlined the consequences of crime and rebellion. The arrangement of events allowed political leaders to communicate values of control, generosity, and strength without formal addresses. Audiences received these cues as part of the spectacle. The choice of when to stage particular events was also political. Elections, anniversaries, and military triumphs often received special programs. An emperor's birthday, the dedication of a building, or the memory of a deceased official could all be reasons to enlarge the scale of the games. Meanwhile, during times of unrest, an increase in public entertainments served as a form of social management. Politicians understood that a contented crowd could reduce tensions. They also knew that anxiety or visible unrest in the stands could have political consequences. For this reason, some magistrates calibrated the tone of the games to suit the mood of the city. This practical use of entertainment as a tool of governance was consistent and deliberate. Audience behavior was an integral part of the spectacle. People came to the amphitheater not only to observe, but to participate. Cheering, booing, and gestures communicated favor or disapproval. Spectators shouted for particular fighters or for specific outcomes. They expressed approval when skill and bravery appeared, and they voiced displeasure when a match disappointed expectations. Over time, patterns of interaction developed. Regular attendees learned to read the crowd and to respond. Vocal responses could influence decisions by editors or by an emperor present. Public opinion in the arena mattered. Betting and informal wagers formed a notable part of audience life. People placed bets on the outcomes of fights or on the performance of favored fighters. Betting took many forms. Some wagers were casual and made among friends in the stands. Others were larger and involved organized networks of bettors. Tokens, coins, or promises of future favors recorded many agreements. Books and clerks sometimes kept track of arranged fights and their results, creating a record that supported betting markets. Meanwhile, the presence of clear favorites and long-standing reputations made betting a regular activity. Gambling served both as a source of excitement and as a method of social exchange. The culture of betting affected how spectators watched matches. Those with a stake in the result paid careful attention to tactics and timing. They noted a fighter's style, his injuries, and the condition of his armor. Over time, some members of the crowd gained reputations for skillful assessment of matches. These observers could influence others by pointing out likely outcomes. In this way, knowledge circulated across the stands. Betting also reinforced loyalties. A man who regularly backed a particular fighter developed a personal attachment to his fate. This attachment made the crowd's reactions more intense. Cheering and grief were social acts as well as personal responses. The arena also functioned as a place for legal punishment and public justice. Executions were carried out during the games as a form of demonstration. Convicted criminals were sometimes displayed and then sentenced publicly. The nature of the punishment depended on the crime and on social status. Those condemned to death by the authorities might be sent into staged combats with animals, or they might be executed in reenactments that followed mythic or historical scripts. These staged scenes often borrowed from literary sources. For example, a condemned man might be asked to play the role of a treacherous mythic figure before he was put to death. Such performances had a ritual element. They presented the law's final decision and demonstrated its consequences to the assembled citizens. Execution by beasts or damnation to animals served a particular symbolic function. It made the condemned an object of spectacle and of state authority. In practice, animals used in these punishments included those trained for venations, as well as specially selected predators. The process required planning. Keepers and handlers coordinated the arrival of animals and managed cages. Meanwhile, the legal apparatus ensured that sentences were carried out in a manner that the public could witness. The presence of executions within the broader program reminded the crowd that the spectacle also upheld civic order. For officials, this public enforcement of criminal penalties provided a visible affirmation of control. Staged battles with animals occupied a large space within the program. Venations combined display, hunting skills, and sometimes narrative sequences. Professional hunters and specialized fighters, called beshurai or venators, carried out these events. They trained to confront animals in controlled ways. Their work required knowledge of animal behavior and of tactics to avoid fatal injury. In some cases, the encounters were genuine tests of skill. In others, structure and support reduced the danger. Over time, entertainers developed techniques to choreograph encounters. so that the spectacle remained intense, but did not always end in the death of the human participant. The variety of animals displayed in the arena reflected the empire's wide geography. Animals came from distant provinces and were presented as rarities. Organizers recorded the origin of notable beasts and sometimes published lists of animals brought to the games. Transporting and maintaining these creatures required logistic effort. Specialized workers cared for cages, arranged fodder, and managed water. Meanwhile, veterinarians and attendants tended to injuries to valuable animals. The costs associated with bringing exotic animals to the arena contributed to the prestige of the games. Those who could afford large numbers of specimens signaled status and reach. Staging a venatio also involved effects and props. Scaffolding, nets, and barriers allowed hunters to move and to seek protection. Sometimes, animals were pitted against each other as part of a spectacle. At other times, a hunter demonstrated skills in single combat. The audience followed these displays attentively. They watched the movements of both hunter and animal, assessing danger and applauding narrow escapes. In this way, the Venetians combined technical skill, spectacle, and the management of risk. Throughout all these elements, the life of the arena reflected broader social and political realities. Ceremonies and rituals framed the events as civic acts. Political motives shaped both the content and the timing of the shows. Audience behavior and betting culture produced a lively and participatory atmosphere. Executions and staged animal battles served as public demonstrations of law, control, and spectacle. To watch a day at the games was to observe the intersection of entertainment, ritual, and governance. The routines that organized the amphitheater allowed the city to transform violence and display into a form of public life that citizens could attend, judge, and remember. Over time, these practices became an expected part of urban culture, repeated and adapted to suit changing circumstances and the aims of those who held power. Fame for a gladiator began with public attention and the careful use of a name. Fighters often adopted nicknames that helped them stand out. Some names described a fighting style. Others signaled a place of origin or a physical trait. In many cases, a simple epithet was enough to attract a following. Over time, crowds learned to recognize a few favorites. Those favorites came to embody certain expectations. A man who fought with steady defense or with quick attacks gathered fans who preferred that style. Meanwhile, a name that suggested strength or exotic origin could widen a fighter's appeal. Nicknames also served practical purposes. They made fighters easier to identify in records and on lists of matches. Promoters used them to advertise events. Posters and announcements often displayed the short names and brief descriptions that would catch the eye of a passerby. In this way, a good nickname functioned as an early form of branding. It created a compact identity that people could repeat and share. For the gladiator, the repeated mention of a name in public notices reinforced presence. It turned single appearances into a developing reputation. Reputation grew through repeated appearances and through specific notable achievements. A decisive victory, a narrow escape, or a dramatic recovery from injury all could increase a fighter's renown. Observers compared performances and retold memorable moments in taverns and baths. Over time, reputations became a part of a fighter's income. Popularity could lead to larger crowds and to more favorable matchups. Crowds who loved a particular fighter were willing to pay to see him again. In this way, the public's memory and the frequency of engagement shaped a gladiator's career. Alongside public fame, material rewards could follow. Sponsorships took different forms. A wealthy sponsor might fund a fighter's upkeep in return for the right to claim a connection. Patrons provided money for armor, for food, and for treatments after combat. They sometimes covered the costs of a display or a public appearance. Meanwhile, traders and craftsmen found opportunities in the fame of successful fighters. A smith, for instance, might supply custom equipment and advertise the association. In this way, the economic networks of patrons, artisans, and entertainers supported a gladiator's material needs. Gifts came from many directions. Admirers in the crowd sometimes presented small tokens. Jewelry, cloth, and coins appeared as signs of favor. At times, a fighter received larger gifts from an organizer or an elite guest. These presents might include land, freed status for family members, or a formal gratuity. Meanwhile, municipal officials occasionally rewarded favored fighters with public marks of esteem. The ceremony could be modest, such as presenting a laurel or a portable table, or more conspicuous, like giving access to privileged spaces during public events. In this way, material recognition reinforced social bonds. Special privileges followed as a practical consequence of fame. A highly regarded fighter often enjoyed a lighter daily workload in training, more comfortable quarters, or improved medical attention. Trainers and managers adjusted schedules to preserve a prized gladiator for future bouts. Over time, these accommodations could become standard expectations for top performers. Access to superior medical care extended a career in many cases. Meanwhile, preferential treatment in the dining room or in living quarters created visible marks of status among fellow fighters. In this way, the hierarchy inside a training school reflected public distinctions outside the arena. The social dimension of fame extended into direct contacts with members of the elite. Aristocrats sometimes attended events with particular interest in known fighters. They invited certain gladiators to private gatherings or to social functions where a public display of bravery and training was valued. These meetings allowed fighters to move in circles they would otherwise not enter. Meanwhile, aristocrats gained novelty and a form of entertainment and control through such associations. In some instances, a fighter's presence at a private table became a sign of favor and of the patron's capacity to reach into different social worlds. Interaction with wealthy Romans could produce lasting benefits. A sponsor might arrange for a fighter to perform in a private show, which often paid well. Such arrangements allowed fighters to earn sums that were not possible through regular public matches alone. In this way, private appearances functioned as supplemental income. They also increased a fighter's visibility among influential people. When a prominent guest publicly praised a fighter, that praise traveled through social networks. Over time, endorsements by the right people could open new doors. Women of the upper classes formed another important group of potential associates. Roman women, especially those in elite households, sometimes followed the careers of favored fighters. Their support ranged from casual interest to more direct patronage. A woman might attend games and publicly cheer for a particular man, or she might send gifts and letters of admiration. In some cases, elite women used their influence to secure small honors or improvements in a fighter's conditions. Meanwhile, the visibility of such relationships sent social signals about taste and affiliation among women themselves. Over time, these interactions formed part of a broader cultural pattern in which public spectacle connected different layers of society. Romantic or personal relationships could develop as well, though they were often complicated by social expectations. A gladiator and an elite woman faced barriers of status and family pressure. For the woman's household, an association with a fighter could be delicate. Some families found such connections acceptable as a private indulgence. Others considered them improper. Meanwhile, a gladiator who entered a close association with an elite woman risked both social scrutiny and possible exclusion by his own peers. In this way, personal ties across classes remained possible, but fraught with practical and social limits. Fame and wealth did not eliminate the structural boundaries that defined Roman social life. Legal status and ancestral rank continued to matter. A popular and wealthy gladiator might acquire possessions and local renown. He could live comfortably and be treated with visible respect. Nevertheless, certain formal barriers remained. A fighter who was a slave, for example, could not hold public office. Even after manumission, a former gladiator faced limitations in political life and in civic honors. Social mobility was possible in limited ways, but it rarely erased earlier disadvantages. Over time, some successful fighters did manage to change their private positions. A freedman who had earned money could support a family, buy property, and secure a stable household. He might invest in a trade or in rental property. In these practical ways, financial security altered daily life and possibilities. Meanwhile, membership in a guild or a local association might give a former fighter a foothold in civic society. In this way, economic gains allowed new kinds of stability, even if they did not produce full equality with those born into higher ranks. Public recognition sometimes involved formal honors that hinted at partial acceptance. Cities and municipalities occasionally presented crowns, symbolic weapons, and other tokens to celebrated fighters. These honors did not confer civic office, but they marked a public appreciation that could last. Inscriptions and public lists recorded victories and prizes. Over time, a favorable record created a historical footprint. Families could point to such honors in later generations as evidence of social improvement. In this way, recognition preserved an individual's memory beyond the arena. Despite these gains, limits persisted in cultural attitudes. Many Romans continued to view gladiators as belonging to the world of spectacle and compulsion. The association with violence, with the body as a public instrument, and with a controlled environment of training shaped persistent judgments. Some writers of the day expressed scorn or pity. Meanwhile, elite moralists debated the social effects of the games and often criticized the admiration of martial vigor in a controlled setting. These opinions influenced public discourse and reinforced boundaries that money alone could not erase. Legal constraints further defined limits to mobility. Laws regulated who could hold particular priesthoods, who could serve in magistracies, and who could own certain kinds of property. Even a wealthy freedman could find doors closed. Over time, networks of patronage and marriage provided real pathways for integration, but such routes required acceptance by established families. For many fighters, the cost of such acceptance was high, and the prospects uncertain. In this way, the law and custom combined to restrict full social assimilation. Family and origin also mattered. A gladiator from a free provincial background who entered the arena by choice could sometimes maintain different social options than a man enslaved at birth. The former might keep connections to a local community and return with some dignity to civic life. The latter, if freed, still carried the legacy of servitude in public memory. Meanwhile, regional differences influenced the possibilities for social advancement. In some towns, a returning champion received public honors similar to those given to local magistrates. In others, suspicion and marginalization followed him. In this way, the local context shaped outcomes as much as individual talent. The internal world of the training school provided another layer of social structure. Successful fighters who earned wealth often stood higher in the informal hierarchy among their peers. They could afford better food and equipment. Fellow fighters sometimes respected or envied them. Yet the social distance between a top gladiator and his trainer, or between him and the manager of the school, remained clear. Authority within the ludus continued to be exercised through contracts, discipline, and negotiated expectations. Even celebrated fighters answered to those who controlled scheduling and promotion. In this way, internal governance maintained boundaries on independence. Nevertheless, stories of advancement circulated and influenced aspirations. Young trainees observed the material benefits that fame could bring. They watched how certain fighters parlayed victories into practical rewards. For trainers and managers, the success of a prize fighter represented both skill and financial opportunity. In this way, the system reproduced itself through incentives, even as it retained structural limits. Over time, these patterns produced a stable, if unequal, social environment. Finally, the intersection of fame, wealth, and status revealed a complex social landscape. Public acclaim provided tangible benefits, and private patronage could transform a fighter's material life. Relationships with aristocrats and women created opportunities and complications. Meanwhile, legal and cultural constraints continued to define what mobility was possible. In this way, the life of a gladiator became a mixture of public recognition and persistent limitation. Observed calmly, these patterns show how public spectacle and private advantage interacted, and how reputation could change daily conditions without necessarily altering the deeper structures of Roman social order. Life in and around the training school involved more than drills and matches. Gladiators lived together, ate together, and slept under the same roof. Over time, these conditions produced close personal ties. Families of origin were often distant or absent. In that space, friendships and a sense of belonging formed. Men who shared a routine of early mornings, hard work, and occasional danger learned to depend on one another. They shared wounds and meals, tasks, and confidences. In this way, daily association created practical bonds that felt like family. Friendships among fighters took many shapes. Some men paired up as training partners. They practiced together to sharpen specific techniques, and they supported one another in recovery from injury. A training partner might help with stretching, apply simple dressings, or fetch a favored food. Meanwhile, other friendships developed around shared origins. Men from the same province or the same town sometimes found comfort in a familiar language or a remembered custom. Over time, those small continuities reduced isolation and made the training school a less foreign place. Older and more experienced fighters sometimes took younger trainees under their care. They taught them how to read the signals of an audience, how to pace themselves in a long season, and how to conserve strength between matches. This exchange was partly practical instruction. It also served as mentorship. A senior fighter might negotiate a better schedule for his protege, or intervene with the manager when a young man's recovery needed attention. In this way, informal hierarchies produced channels of support within the school. Outside the immediate group of fellow fighters, a gladiator's social circle could include trainers, lanistae or managers, physicians, and craftspeople. The relations with these figures were often businesslike, but they could also become friendly over time. A smith who repaired weapons daily could exchange news and gossip with a fighter. A cook who knew which meals aided recovery might be trusted with small requests. Such connections mattered for comfort and for survival. In this way, the social world of a gladiator extended beyond the ring into practical networks. When family ties existed, they took varied forms. Some gladiators had been free men who joined a school by choice or necessity. They might keep regular contacts with wives, parents, or children in their home region. Letters and visits could preserve those connections. Meanwhile, many fighters had been enslaved or captured and had little or no contact with their birth families. For many of these men, the closest kin were the companions in the training school. Over time, however, even men who lacked biological families formed durable attachments that resembled family life. Marriage and love affairs were part of that wider social landscape. Some relationships were open and acknowledged. A few gladiators married women in local communities, and they tried to balance domestic life with the demands of training and performance. These unions could be simple and practical. A wife might manage a small household, weave cloth, or sell goods to help support the household. Meanwhile, a husband returned from the arena with irregular income and an uncertain schedule. Over time, such arrangements required negotiation and mutual adjustment. Other relationships were secret or constrained by circumstances. Elite women sometimes formed private attachments to fighters. These relationships could be discreet, and they often required secrecy to protect both parties. Family expectations and public opinion made such ties delicate. Meanwhile, a gladiator might develop a relationship with a woman of lower social status, such as a servant or a market vendor. Those connections were more visible, but could still face practical difficulties, especially when the fighter traveled for matches, or when a manager enforced strict regulations about absence. In some instances, affairs and marriages provoked scandal. Public life magnified private acts. A relationship that crossed obvious social boundaries drew attention. When a man of standing associated openly with a fighter, gossip could follow. In certain cases, a relationship led to legal action or social censure. Meanwhile, managers and owners sometimes intervened to prevent connections that they believed would distract a fighter or damage the school's reputation. In this way, private relationships were not only personal, they carried social consequences. Romantic ties created practical problems as well. Childbirth and rearing required steady presence, which a fighter could not always provide. A family left behind could be vulnerable to poverty if a husband or father was injured or killed in combat. When a gladiator obtained freedom, the situation changed but remained complicated. A freed man who had married while still a fighter sometimes needed to establish stable work to support his household. Over time, some former gladiators succeeded in doing so. Others struggled. In this way, personal life frequently hinged on economic realities. Religion and belief offered another domain where personal life found expression. Gladiators practiced and observed a variety of religious customs. They came from many places and many traditions. Some maintained ancestral rites from their home regions, while others adopted Roman practices. Personal piety could be private or communal. A group might gather at a shrine before a fight to ask for protection. Meanwhile, an individual might keep a small charm or image for personal comfort. In this way, religion became a practical resource for managing fear and uncertainty. Superstition also played a role. Certain signs and omens were interpreted as warnings or as good fortune. Fighters watched the flight of birds, the behavior of animals, or the arrangement of garments before an event. They sometimes observed rituals that had nothing to do with formal religion, but served to steady the mind. A small routine before stepping into the arena, adjusting a strap, touching a favorite talisman, or repeating a brief phrase could help to focus attention. Over time, these practices formed part of the mental preparation for combat. Charms and amulets were common. Simple objects could be carried under clothing or sewn into a garment. Materials varied. Some charms were made of metal, others of bone, and others of cloth. In many cases, the charm represented a protective figure or a symbol associated with a local deity. Meanwhile, priests and ritual specialists could be consulted to perform rites believed to increase safety or success. For a gladiator, such measures offered a sense of control in an unpredictable life. In this way, belief and superstition functioned as both comfort and practical habit. Religious observance could also mark turning points in a career. A fighter who survived a particularly dangerous bout might dedicate a small offering at a temple. A healed wound could prompt a private vow or a visible gesture of thanks. Over time, those acts accumulated into a record of survival that was both personal and social. In this way, faith and gratitude connected the private experience of danger to established religious practices in the wider community. Daily life outside training included routines designed to preserve health and readiness. Sleep and rest were important. A fighter who trained hard needed predictable rest cycles. Managers scheduled times for repair and recovery. Meanwhile, meals were planned with practical aims. Diet emphasized staples that provided calories and muscle maintenance. Grains, legumes, and occasional meat or fish were typical components. Trainers monitored food intake to ensure that men had sufficient energy without excess weight. In this way, daily habits reinforced physical readiness. Hygiene and basic medical care were also part of the routine. Baths were frequent for those who could access them. The bathhouse served hygienic needs and social ones at the same time. For some fighters, shared bathing was a place to talk quietly and to exchange news. Meanwhile, simple medical treatments, herbal poultices, binding of wounds, massage, were standard responses to the wear of training. Physicians might be consulted in more serious cases. Over time, familiarity with common injuries developed into practical know-how among trainers and senior fighters. Leisure activities were modest but meaningful. Men played simple board games, wagered small sums, or practiced with musical instruments. Letters and stories from home were read aloud when someone could read. Singing and recitation offered a way to relax together. Meanwhile, some fighters took up small crafts. Repairing gear, weaving, or carving items could occupy quiet hours. These activities provided focus and a sense of achievement beyond the ring. In this way, leisure filled the gaps in a schedule otherwise dominated by training. Management of money and possessions was a recurring concern. Fighters saved what they could, and the most successful sometimes accumulated small estates or freed family members. Others invested in practical items, better bedding, stronger protective gear, or improved footwear. Loans and debts could also create pressure. Money that arrived quickly from a successful public appearance could disappear as quickly in social demands or in poor investments. Meanwhile, prudent management extended a man's ability to plan beyond the immediate season of matches. In this way, household economy mattered deeply. Socializing with the local community was part of daily life. Markets, taverns, and public baths were common meeting places. Interaction with civilians produced a balance between the enclosed life of the school and the broader city. A fighter might sell services, accept small jobs, or receive visitors who brought news and goods. Over time, these interactions created a modest public identity beyond the spectacle of combat. In this way, integration with everyday urban life helped sustain practical needs and personal connections. Letters and remembrances played a role in preserving relationships. When distance separated a fighter from relatives, written messages carried support and news. Meanwhile, souvenirs and small tokens sent between lovers or family members maintained bonds across time. In cases where a gladiator became free, formal documentation, contracts, agreements, and records helped establish a legal status that altered daily options. Over time, written communication turned personal ties into durable arrangements. Conflict and reconciliation were part of normal social life. Arguments over money, jealousy, or perceived slights occurred. Managers sometimes punished breaches of discipline. Meanwhile, the communal nature of life in the school encouraged conflict resolution. Ritualized apologies, small gifts, or agreed tasks could restore peace. In this way, social cohesion remained possible even in a competitive and hierarchical environment. When a fighting career ended, relationships often shifted. Retirement could mean returning to a home community, finding a trade, or living on savings. Family ties that had been distant could become central again. Friends from the school might drift apart or remain close. Some retired fighters maintained places of honor in local social life, while others lived quietly. In this way, the arc of personal life extended beyond the arena. Taken together, these patterns show a life that was practical, social, and often constrained. Friendships and family-like bonds helped men endure the demands of training. Love and scandal shaped reputations and tested social limits. Religious practices and small charms eased the weight of risk. Daily habits beyond fighting, sleep, food, hygiene, simple crafts, and socializing structured ordinary time. Observed calmly, these elements present a steady picture of personal life, one shaped by work and by human needs for connection, care, and continuity. To earn freedom from the arena required more than a single victory. In practice, several different paths could lead a fighter out of the school and into ordinary life. Some men gained their liberty by repeated success in the public games. Over seasons, they demonstrated skill, endurance, and a capacity to survive dangerous encounters. Meanwhile, public favor mattered. The reaction of spectators could influence an editor or an owner, and applause or persistent calls for mercy sometimes helped a man's cause. In this way, sustained performance and popular support created a practical route to manumission. A second route was direct manumission by the owner. A lanista, the manager of a training school, or a private owner could free a gladiator for reasons that mixed personal, economic, and political considerations. An owner might calculate that a long-serving fighter had become less profitable in the ring, and that releasing him would simplify matters. Alternatively, a manager could free a man as a reward for loyal service, or to generate good publicity for his school. In certain cases, the owner's decision reflected a business calculation about the value of a freed fighter's continued affiliation as a trainer or public face. In this way, private judgment played a decisive role. Some fighters obtained their freedom by purchase. They saved portions of prize money or received gifts from admirers. With careful economy, a man could accumulate the sums required to buy his release. Meanwhile, friends or relatives sometimes contributed. This option required time and basic trust in a stable life beyond the arena. A purchase could be arranged formally, with documents recording the sale and the promise of freedom. In this way, money and planning opened a third path. Another route was special mercy granted in an individual match. Editors, sometimes under pressure from the crowd or moved by a particular performance, could spare a man's life and grant him freedom. Famous descriptions of such moments survive in a few sources. When a man's skill or conduct impressed a sponsor, the outcome could include a formal offer of liberty. These were dramatic moments, but they were not the only ones to lead to freedom. More often, liberty arrived through a combination of steady service, financial arrangements, and the owner's final judgment. The legal forms of release mattered as well. When a slave was freed, Roman law required a formal act and a record. A document would record the man's new status as a freedman and list obligations that remained toward the former owner, now the patron. If a gladiator had been a free volunteer who had entered the school by choice, known as an auctoratus, his situation differed. A volunteer had surrendered liberty by contract and could not be manumitted in the same way. When his agreed term was over, the contract might end and he could resume private life, but the processes were distinct. In this way, the prior legal status of a fighter shaped the procedures and consequences of freedom. When freedom came, it was often marked by a single, simple object, a wooden sword called the rudis. The meaning of this sword was plain and public. In the management of the arena, the rudis served as a tangible symbol of a new legal state. Presenting a rudies to a man signaled that he would no longer fight as a gladiator. The object itself was not a fine weapon. It was lightweight, plain, and clearly not intended for combat. Its value was symbolic. When a fighter received a rudies in public, spectators and officials could see that his status had changed. The ceremony varied in scale. Sometimes the presentation occurred in the arena at the end of a contest. An editor, an owner, or a sponsor might step forward and hand the wooden sword to the man who had earned it. Witnesses could include fellow fighters, trainers, and the assembled crowd. In many cases, the audience applauded. In other instances, the presentation happened in private, with a document recording the manumission and witnesses signing to confirm the legal change. Meanwhile, the manner of presentation might be modest or elaborate, depending on the status of the men involved and the desire of the owner to make a public display. In this way, the ritual could be tailored to the circumstances. Receiving the rudies altered everyday realities. A freedman could no longer be forced into gladiatorial combat by that owner. He gained the legal protections and the social markers of his new status. Often he adopted a new name, taking the family name of his former owner as part of the Roman naming practice. At the same time, obligations remained. A freedman typically entered a patronage relationship with his former master. The patron could still expect certain services or honors. Financial ties and legal responsibilities did not vanish in an instant. In this way, the wooden sword signaled change without erasing previous connections. Life after retirement took many forms. The most common immediate option was to remain in the world of the arena. Skilled veterans were valuable as trainers. A man who had survived years of combat possessed practical knowledge of technique, rhythm, and the management of a fighter's body. Trainers and doxies, or instructors, used that experience to condition new recruits and to plan matchups. Over time, many schools relied on veteran fighters to teach posture, weapon handling, and the strategies that preserved life in the ring. In this way, retirement often meant a gradual shift from performance to instruction. Some veterans became managers or assistants to the lanista. They handled recruitment, managed equipment, or negotiated contracts. The administrative side of the profession required experience and trust. A former fighter who understood the economics of the arena could be a useful intermediary between owners, trainers, and the public. Meanwhile, when a retired man remained connected to the school, he could help preserve its reputation, drawing on his past fame to attract new talent or clients. In this way, practical governance became a natural career for many. Another path led to service as an armed attendant. Wealthy patrons, municipal officials, and military leaders sometimes employed former gladiators as bodyguards or private retainers. Their training made them competent in close combat, and their loyalty could be highly valued. In late periods, such retainers were known under specialized terms, and commanders used them as household troops or as local enforcers. The steady pay and relative stability of such positions attracted men who preferred to use force under direction, rather than to risk the unpredictability of the arena. In this way, a retired fighter could move from public spectacle to private service. Not all transitions were lawful or safe. When steady work was unavailable, some retired fighters fell into crime. Banditry, robbery, or service in irregular groups offered income and a degree of autonomy. The skills of a gladiator were easily turned to violence outside the bounds of public regulation. Meanwhile, a few men sold their names and reputations to unsavory enterprises, joining street gangs, or providing muscle for illegal activities. These outcomes were not unusual in crowded cities where opportunities were limited. In this way, the end of a career sometimes marked a slide into danger rather than a peaceful retirement. Other veterans used their earnings and their reputations to build small businesses. Some opened taverns, ran boarding houses, or worked as innkeepers. Others pursued crafts or trade, selling trained animals, repaired equipment, or goods related to the spectacle. A few invested in rental housing or in agricultural land in a home province. Those options required planning and the ability to translate a short career into stable resources. When successful, such transitions allowed a man to support a family and to integrate into ordinary civic life. In this way, careful management produced a different sort of safety. The social standing of a former gladiator could vary widely. A freedman who returned to a provincial town might be welcomed as a local celebrity. In smaller communities, the fame of past exploits could translate into real influence. Over time, some veterans served in municipal administration, especially in towns where their local popularity mattered. They could hold minor magistracies, oversee public games, or serve on councils dealing with daily affairs. Such roles did not elevate a man to the highest levels of Roman politics, but they provided status and a degree of power at the local level. In this way, a public career could have local political benefits. There were exceptional cases in which a veteran became a figure of larger renown. Stories survive of men whose records were remembered on tombstones and public inscriptions. One known pair of fighters, Priscus and Verus, fought before the Emperor Titus in 80 CE and received freedom in a double award that was recorded by contemporary writers. Their case shows how an exceptional contest, coupled with imperial favor, could produce a widely noted moment of manumission. Another figure, Flamma, a Syrian who served in the arena, accepted freedom several times and remained famous enough to be remembered on a monument. These examples were rare, yet they illustrate that a man's reputation could outlast his active career. Some veterans also entered patronage networks that connected them to elite households. A wealthy individual who admired a fighter might provide support, employment, or gifts after retirement. Such patronage could secure a stable position as a bodyguard, a personal attendant, or an employee in a household. In some cases, the relationship offered a direct path into the employ of local elites and a reliable income. Meanwhile, ties to patrons also implied obligations and a loss of full independence. In this way, relationships with the powerful could open opportunities and impose constraints. The public memory of veteran gladiators shaped later generations' views of the profession. Monuments, epitaphs, and public lists recorded names and achievements. These records preserved the plain facts of victories, the length of a career, and the presence of erudits. Over time, those inscriptions allowed families and communities to recall the life of a man who had once fought in the arena. For relatives and neighbors, the record served as a practical link between performance and social standing. In this way, the material traces of a career, contributed to a veteran's posthumous reputation. Retirement sometimes meant a return to domestic concerns. A freedman who had a wife or children needed steady income and a place to live. In towns and villages, men sought ordinary work, took on small responsibilities, and rejoined family networks. Religious observance and local festivals resumed central roles. A man who had spent years in the closed life of a school often re-entered broader civic life by attending religious rites, serving local associations, and participating in market life. These everyday duties required a degree of regularity that differed from the seasonal rhythms of the arena. In this way, ordinary domestic life became the field of a quieter effort. The social risks of retirement were real. Injury, chronic pain, and psychological strain could limit a man's capacity to work. A retired gladiator might require ongoing medical care for wounds that had never healed fully. The absence of a stable pension system meant that long-term health problems could become a family burden. Meanwhile, the loss of the school's camaraderie could produce isolation for men who had formed their main social ties within the training barracks. For some, reintegration was gradual and incomplete. In this way, health and social connection shaped the quality of life after the Rudies. Taken together, these patterns form a steady picture of endings and new beginnings. Earning freedom required a mixture of skill, good fortune, legal procedure, and sometimes money. The Rudies marked the transition in a clear and public way. After that moment, a range of options became possible. Many men remained connected to the world that had trained them, serving as instructors, managers, or retainers. Others moved into business, local politics, or domestic life. Some fell into crime or lived in hardship. A small number achieved fame that carried meaning beyond their own lives. Observed calmly, the story of the Rudies and of retirement shows how a single ceremonial act could open many different pathways. In this way, the end of one career represented the start of varied and practical lives beyond the arena. Death was a frequent companion in the world of the arena, and it shaped how people remembered those who fought. Inside the amphitheater, some deaths were sudden and unambiguous. A thrust to the heart or a cut to a major artery could prove fatal within minutes. Broken bones and crushed organs sometimes led to slow and painful endings. Other deaths followed the immediate spectacle. A fighter who survived the bout might still succumb later to infection from an untreated wound. Medical care in antiquity could stop bleeding and set bones, but antibiotics did not exist. Over time, even a small injury could become life-threatening. Not all deadly outcomes came from direct combat. Crowd events sometimes produced crushes and trampling when spectators surged forward. Accidents during animal hunts could cause dismemberment or fatal mauling. Stage machinery and ramps failed on occasion. Meanwhile, training at the ludus was itself dangerous. Sparring went wrong, wooden training weapons shattered, and falls from practice caused head injuries. A man could die in the barracks as surely as he could die in front of 10,000 people. In this way, the everyday work of a gladiator included constant exposure to lethal risk. Deaths outside the arena had other causes, but they were common too. Disease swept through crowded urban neighborhoods and military camps. Respiratory illnesses, digestive infections, and fevers could prove fatal. Some fighters came from distant provinces and carried exposure to unfamiliar pathogens. Over time, chronic conditions made men vulnerable, especially after repeated injuries. Assaults on streets and participation in riots could end in murder. Legal execution was also a cause of death for those convicted of crimes. In these contexts, a former or active fighter could die in ways unrelated to organized spectacle. The social status of a gladiator influenced how his death was treated. A slave who died might receive only a simple burial paid for by the owner. A freeborn volunteer who fell in the ring could be claimed by family rights and receive more elaborate funerary observances. Meanwhile, celebrated figures sometimes earned public forms of commemoration. The variety of practices is visible in the archaeological record. Tombstones, epitaphs, and grave goods allow us to see differences in how communities marked death. In this way, the manner of burial reflected both legal status and local custom. Funerary rites for fallen gladiators combined common Roman practices with specific references to the life of a fighter. Many tombstones record a name, age, number of contests, and the school or owner. Some inscriptions describe victories or note the number of times a man had been wounded. Symbols of the profession also appear. A palm branch, a helmet, or a depiction of a man in fighting pose could identify the deceased as a gladiator. In several epitaphs, the wooden sword called the rudis appears as evidence that a man had been released from service before death. The inclusion of such items made a grave a clear record of personal history. Private funerary rites often began with washing the body and preparing it for display. Kin or fellow fighters might attend the waking and share memories. Funerary meals and offerings followed, and in some cases the school or owner contributed resources. The funeral procession led to burial outside the city walls, in accordance with Roman law and custom. When a fighter had no family or insufficient funds, comrades sometimes pooled money to cover the costs. In this way, fragile social networks within the training school provided practical support at the end of life. Public forms of memory also took shape. Some towns and benefactors erected monuments or public inscriptions to commemorate notable fighters. These memorials could list achievements and record the terms of service. Municipal officials occasionally allowed or sponsored games as a way of honoring the dead. In other examples, a wealthy patron might commission an elaborate tomb as a display of status and sympathy. Over time, these durable objects served as local registers of names and careers. Scholars today rely on such records to reconstruct the lives of many individual fighters. Graffiti is another important source for understanding how gladiators were remembered. In cities like Pompeii and Herculaneum, walls preserved informal inscriptions made by ordinary people. Names scratched on stone include lists of favorite fighters, wagers, insults, and declarations of admiration. In some cases, a graffiti inscription records the outcome of a match and the name of the victor. These scraps of writing give a sense of immediate public reaction. They also suggest popular attachments to particular fighters that could last beyond a single event. Meanwhile, graffiti reminds us that memory was created by many voices, not only by official monuments. Mosaics and frescoes captured the image of fighters in domestic and civic spaces. Artists depicted bouts, training scenes, and single figures in the equipment of their trade. Such images could decorate private homes, public baths, and places of business. A mosaic in a villa might show a bestiarius, a man fighting beasts, complete with details of clothing and weaponry. These visual records combined artistic convention with precise items of equipment, and they help historians understand how fighters presented themselves publicly. In this way, the visual culture of the Roman world kept images of gladiators in everyday view. Poetry and prose provide another layer of memory. Writers such as Martial and Juvenal composed short pieces that mention fighters, note famous bouts, and sometimes praise particular qualities like endurance or courage. Other authors used gladiators as figures in moral argument. A poet might complain about the appetite of the crowds or the excesses of spectacle, while a historian could record specific contests and imperial patronage. Literary sources are selective, but they reveal how elite circles discussed gladiators and their deaths. Taken together with graffiti and visual art, literature allows us to see how different social groups participated in remembering. Epitaphs often summarize a life in brief and direct terms. A short inscription can tell us a name, an age, the number of times that man had fought, and perhaps the identity of a patron or owner. Some epitaphs underline loyalty, while others emphasize victory. In certain graves, the formula records that the deceased was a former slave who had obtained freedom. Those details matter. They show how memorialization served both personal mourning and public identification. Over time, these concise records provided a durable form of memory that could be read by neighbors and by later generations. Archaeology adds material detail to textual and visual records. Skeletal remains sometimes show healed fractures or signs of repeated trauma, consistent with armed fighting. Analysis of bones can reveal patterns of injury, nutritional status, and the effects of chronic wear. When a buried individual displays multiple healed wounds in particular parts of the body, researchers consider these as possible indicators of a combat career. Meanwhile, associated grave goods and tomb inscriptions help confirm identification. Scientific study thus complements literary and artistic testimony to build a fuller picture. Memory of gladiators did not remain fixed in antiquity. Over the centuries, attitudes changed. Christian writers condemned the games as immoral, and laws gradually reduced the scope of public combat. Many tombs and inscriptions fell into ruin, and knowledge of specific names was lost. Yet fragments persisted in local memory, written records, and reused stones. During later periods, scholars and antiquarians read surviving texts and examined ruins. In this way, the past of the arena did not vanish, but it was transformed by new perspectives and new cultural priorities. In the early modern period, interest in antiquity revived attention to gladiators. Collectors, artists, and scholars sought to recover ancient inscriptions and objects. Engravings and prints circulated images of combat. Writers debated what the spectacles had meant. During the 19th century, a more systematic archaeological study began to place individual remains and inscriptions in context. Museums acquired artifacts and displayed them to a public eager to see objects from Rome. These activities shaped modern perceptions and created a foundation for popular images of the fighter. film and literature in the 20th century amplified and reshaped the gladiator's image. Motion pictures presented elaborate spectacles that emphasized drama and heroism. Novelists reused ancient settings to explore themes of freedom and violence. These adaptations often simplified complex historical realities to fit a narrative. Meanwhile, popular culture borrowed the iconography of helmets, tridents, and the arena for advertising, sports, and entertainment. Over time, a figure that had been rooted in specific legal and social circumstances became a more general symbol in international culture. Scholars responded to popular portrayals with detailed work grounded in sources. Epigraphists studied inscriptions. Art historians examined mosaics and frescoes. Bioarchaeologists analyzed bones. Social historians considered the economic and legal frameworks of the schools. The result was a more nuanced public understanding. Histories emphasized the variety of experiences within the profession. They foregrounded the roles of owners, trainers, and manufacturers of equipment. At the same time, researchers drew attention to the everyday lives of fighters, including their families and the communities that shaped their reputations. In museums and exhibitions, visitors now encounter a range of materials that document death, memory, and legacy. Tombstones with carved helmets sit beside explanatory panels. Mosaics show scenes described in accompanying texts. Short films explain how a wooden sword marked the transition from active service to freedom. In many places, curators aim to balance spectacle with context. They explain the legal status of fighters, the social world of the schools, and the risks that accompanied the work. In this way, institutions help the public to see both the human costs and the cultural meanings that survived after death. Modern languages and cultures continue to borrow the figure of the gladiator. Sports metaphors, political rhetoric, and commercial branding sometimes use the image to suggest struggle or competition. Meanwhile, reenactors and historical interest groups study equipment and practice reconstructed techniques. Such activities can raise awareness of historical detail. Yet popular uses often oversimplify. A modern portrayal may omit the crucial facts of slavery, legal status, and the routine dangers of the profession. Recognizing those omissions allows for a more faithful engagement with the past. Memory also appears in local contexts. Some towns display plaques where amphitheaters once stood. Community museums host lectures and publish guides to inscriptions. Family tombs found outside cities have been moved or conserved, and their texts are recorded in public databases. These efforts make the individual names of fighters accessible again. When a record notes that a man died at 25 after 20 bouts, the numerical brevity becomes a human detail. Local preservation thus transforms scattered stones into a connected account of lives lived and lost. Taken together, these layers of evidence show how death, commemoration, and later interpretation have combined to form the modern legacy of the gladiator. The endings that occurred in the sand were only the first step in a longer process. Funerary rites and epitaphs fixed names and careers in stone. Graffiti, mosaics, and poetry kept images alive in everyday contexts. Over centuries, scholars, artists, and popular culture reshaped those images, creating icons that have meaning today. Observed calmly, the record reveals both loss and continuity. and it invites careful attention to the facts that survived. Now we finish with a quiet thought about these lives. Many fighters left the sand and returned to simple routines, and some found final rest in the graves that recorded their names. Families, comrades, and towns remembered them in plain ways. A stone, an inscription, a meal, a shared story. Over time, those marks became the evidence that historians read. As you settle, hold that steady fact in mind. These were real people with hard work, danger, and human ties. Good rest.